52 years ago, two young sisters vanished during an ordinary afternoon in Connecticut, with no signs of a struggle, no clear witnesses, leaving their family plunged into panic and a breakdown that would linger across generations. Authorities quickly launched a large-scale search, putting forward a series of theories from getting lost to an accident, but as leads collapsed one by one and no bodies were found, the investigation gradually stalled and was relegated to a cold case. Yet throughout those years, the feeling that something wasn't right never disappeared, quietly persisting in vague memories, mismatched documents, and an unnamed suspicion. Then decades later, when time seemed to have buried everything, a small detail emerged from present-day life itself, forcing the past to resurface in a way no one could have foreseen. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're interested in cold cases that seemed forgotten, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next developments. In 1955, Connecticut appeared as a typical slice of post-World War II America, where quiet residential areas were rapidly developing, alongside a strong belief in social order, the nuclear family, and the safety of local communities. Children playing outside from morning until evening was a familiar sight. House doors were often left unlocked. Adults trusted that familiar neighbors were enough to watch over one another, and local police mostly handled minor issues rather than serious crimes. In that context, the Miller family lived an unremarkable life. The father went to work regularly, the mother managed the household. Daily routines revolved around school, church, and weekend community activities. Their home sat in the middle of a neighborhood where kids knew every path, every lawn, every shortcut to a neighbor's house. Margaret and Michelle, the two young sisters, grew up in that environment, with daily habits that repeated like clockwork: mornings, leaving with the adults midday playing in familiar areas, evenings returning on time for dinner. The age difference meant their personalities weren't entirely alike, but they were always close, often going together, like an inseparable pair, and that was why adults rarely worried when they saw both appearing somewhere in the neighborhood. That fateful morning began with no clear warning signs, normal weather activities following the usual routine, brief adult conversations about work and chores, while the two children slipped out of the family's sight to continue their everyday play that they knew so well. The last witness to see Margaret and Michelle was a local acquaintance, someone close enough that the girls' presence raised no suspicion, familiar enough that seeing them together was considered completely normal, and that very familiarity meant the final moment they were seen passed without anyone realizing its importance. The first unusual element appeared very faintly, not in the form of a clear danger, but just a sense of something off. The girls didn't show up at their usual spot at the expected time. An initial delay explained by everyday reasons, the delay stretching into longer than normal silence, and the adults around still believing they were just caught up playing somewhere within the neighborhood's reach. As time passed long enough for complacency to start cracking, the Miller family realized something was wrong. Familiar places held no trace of the girls. People who usually saw them had no specific new information, and the last witness could only confirm having seen them earlier, but couldn't recall exactly what happened after that moment. The spontaneous search began on nearby streets, spreading to playgrounds, lawns, and spots kids frequented, with the hope that just a little more time would bring the girls back as always. But each search circle ended without results, and unease quickly turned to panic as harmless assumptions collapsed one after another. The family began facing the possibility that this was no longer an accidental delay but a real incident, and that very moment marked the boundary between an ordinary morning and a day that would change their lives forever. The decision to call the police was made in urgency, as the peace that had enveloped the Connecticut neighborhood in 1955 was officially shattered by an unanswered question. The two children had vanished from what should have been the safest place for them. The Miller family's decision to report to the police immediately placed Margaret and Michelle's disappearance in a completely different framework, because once the information was officially received, the case was no longer a private panic confined to the family or neighborhood, but had become an emergency directly involving child safety, something rare in Connecticut at that time. The local police station took the report in a context where child disappearances were usually classified as getting lost or being late coming home, but the urgency in the reporter's voice, the girls' ages, and the time elapsed since they were last seen, forced the shift to raise the case's priority right from the start. The first responders dispatched to the Miller family's neighborhood arrived while it was still daylight, and their initial action was to establish a flexible control perimeter around the area, believed to be the disappearances' starting point, wide enough to cover streets, paths, and children's usual hangouts, but not so broad as to alarm a community that still saw itself as safe. The cordon wasn't rigid like at major crime scenes, but focused on controlling information flow and defining the spatial boundary where Margaret and Michelle were most likely last seen, because at this stage, police still had to consider multiple possibilities in parallel, from the girls wandering farther than usual on their own, to an accident or approach by a stranger. The last known sighting quickly became the immediate focus, but instead of a single clear location, officers soon realized there were multiple versions of that moment, depending on whom they asked and when. The last witness the family had mentioned was brought in almost immediately, and their initial statement matched what had been said before: the girls together, no signs of distress, no suspicious person with them heading in a familiar neighborhood direction. However, as officers expanded statements to others in the area, the picture grew more complicated, because each person held only a small piece of information, and those pieces didn't fit together perfectly. Some claimed to have seen the girls later than the previously confirmed time, others thought they had turned in a different direction, and some insisted they only remembered seeing one of the girls and weren't sure about the other. In that context, gathering initial statements became a race against time, because investigators knew witness memories grow muddled the longer they're left, mixed with speculation, worry, and community gossip. Alongside statements, police began building a detailed timeline for the first hours after Margaret and Michelle left family supervision, a chronology constructed from tiny markers: the time the girls left home, periods they usually appeared at familiar spots, the last witness sighting, and when the family noticed the unusual delay. Reconstructing the timeline aimed not only to identify the gap, but also to gauge how fast the girls could move in the area, thereby inferring a reasonable early search radius. But the deeper they went into cross-checking markers, the more investigators noticed overlaps that couldn't be simply explained. Some statements seemed to place the girls in two different locations within the same time frame, while others extended their neighborhood presence by tens of minutes beyond the family's initial estimate. And these differences weren't large enough to dismiss as insignificant. It was at that point that the investigation's first twist began to form, not from a shocking discovery, but from realizing that what seemed clear at the outset was slipping away from investigators in a very subtle way. When the last witness was questioned a second time, a small detail in their statement changed, not about specific actions, but about timing and the girls' direction, and that shift was enough to force police to reconsider the entire initial assumption about the final point where Margaret and Michelle appeared together. More troubling was that this contradiction couldn't immediately be attributed to lying, as it fit the psychology of a witness who hadn't realized the moment's importance when it happened, and only later tried to fill memory gaps with unconscious guesses. The emergence of conflicting statements made the already fragile initial investigative picture waver, because if the exact time and location of the girls' last sighting couldn't be pinned down, every cordon and search effort risked being built on a faulty foundation. Officers had to accept that in the most critical early hours, they were dealing not only with the girls' absence, but also with the uncertainty of the very information they relied on to find them, and that uncertainty pushed the investigation into a particularly tense state, where every decision had to be weighed between acting quickly and the risk of going wrong right from the first steps. The uncertainty in the initial statements didn't slow authorities' response, but instead spurred them to expand the search scale faster, because with the girls still unlocated, and every passing minute narrowing the chances of finding them safe, police knew only broad action could compensate for the existing information gaps. Search forces were mobilized beyond the initial shift, including additional police units, rescue personnel, and community volunteers ready to join, because they believed Margaret and Michelle might just be nearby, waiting to be found. Mobilizing the community not only boosted numbers, but tapped locals' familiarity with every alley, trail, and overlooked spot, as those were often blind spots in official searches. The Miller family's neighborhood quickly became the hub of unusually intense activity, with groups assigned specific tasks, streets swept in order, areas marked as checked or not, creating an increasingly dense search map. Police divided the area into concentric circles starting from the presumed last sighting, gradually expanding to farther zones, based on a reasonable walking radius for children their age, assuming that if Margaret and Michelle were on foot, their range would be limited, while if a vehicle was involved, other signs would appear. Each zone was assigned a separate team, tasked not only with looking for direct traces, but noting any anomalies, from out-of-place objects to signs of a stranger in the relevant time frame, with reports continuously fed back to a temporary command center for real-time updates. During this, tips from the community poured in at increasing volume, reflecting a common pattern in large-scale disappearances. As fear spreads, the line between actual observation and personal speculation blurs. Some claimed to have seen the girls in an area farther from the starting point than expected. Others said they saw a similar pair with an unidentified adult, and some simply reported vague images they weren't sure about but didn't want to ignore. Police had to set up a rapid tip filtering system, categorizing them by reliability based on time, location, and consistency with known data, because trying to check every report equally would quickly overload them and lose focus. Among those tips, one stood out as a potential breakthrough, coming from a source deemed more reliable than others, with a relatively specific description of the girls and a time frame fitting the reconstructed timeline. This tip suggested Margaret and Michelle might have appeared at a specific location far enough from the Miller neighborhood to not be immediately ruled out, but close enough to explain why initial searches hadn't reached it. After quickly assessing related factors, police decided to concentrate resources on this lead, treating it as the priority direction for the next phase, because if accurate, early focus could yield results before more time passed. Search teams were redeployed, lower probability areas temporarily deprioritized so manpower and vehicles could shift to the new site, and the surrounding community was alerted to heightened vigilance. For a brief period, the search atmosphere shifted noticeably, as for the first time since the report, there was a feeling that scattered pieces were starting to form a directed picture, and hope that Margaret and Michelle would soon be found spread quickly among searchers and the waiting family. However, that intense focus on this lead also meant other possibilities were temporarily sidelined, a tactical choice but one carrying risk if the tip wasn't as solid as initially thought. As teams thoroughly swept the indicated area, every street structure and open space was checked by protocol, but the deeper they went, confirming signs grew scarce. No items linked to the girls, no additional witnesses confirming sightings there, and the initial details that made the tip convincing gradually lost weight when cross-checked against reality. Investigators began realizing this tip, while not entirely baseless, had formed from a chain of inference, rather than direct observation, and its specific elements no longer held up under detailed scrutiny. The twist of this phase emerged not from a new discovery, but from the gradual collapse of what had been the greatest hope, as each small assumption tied to it was refuted, forcing police to admit they had poured significant resources into a fruitless direction. The decision to pull back forces from that area was made in a heavy atmosphere, as it not only marked the failure of one specific search avenue, but exposed a more troubling reality. After hours of large-scale mobilization, countless tips and sweeping efforts, Margaret and Michelle had left no definitive trace leading to their current whereabouts. The collapse of the main lead returned the search to its initial scattered state, but this time under greater pressure, as enough time had passed for optimistic assumptions to give way to harder questions, and in that moment, search participants began understanding they might not just be looking for two lost children, but facing a situation far more complex than anything the Connecticut community had encountered before. After the leads prioritized in the previous stage collapsed, and the search teams were forced to revert to a broad sweep, a new discovery emerged strong enough to pull the entire investigation's attention in a different direction. While rechecking areas near the original starting point, an item believed to be directly related to Margaret and Michelle was found in a location that had previously undergone a preliminary search. The discovery of this item immediately changed the atmosphere of the search, as it was the first time since the two children disappeared that there was a specific tangible object that could be linked to their presence after the last sighting. Police quickly isolated the discovery area, documenting the exact location, the condition of the item, and its relationship to the surrounding environment, because in child disappearance cases, determining where and how an item was left behind can be decisive in inferring the direction of movement or the victim's condition. Initial analysis focused on whether the item had fallen accidentally during movement or was placed there intentionally, and whether it had appeared at that location before or after the large-scale search began, as each possibility led to entirely different assumptions about the sequence of events. When cross-referenced with the previously established timeline, investigators noted that if the item truly belonged to Margaret or Michelle and was left shortly after they vanished, the discovery location fell within a reasonable range of movement for the two children in the initial time period, making the assumption that they had returned to a familiar area after leaving the last witness's site worth considering. This assumption quickly became central to the new investigative direction, as it aligned with familiar patterns of children in confused or lost situations where they tend to head back to known places rather than continue farther away. Search teams were readjusted once again, with focus shifting back to old routes, places Margaret and Michelle frequented, and areas that could serve as transit points between where they disappeared and the item's discovery location. However, the deeper the analysis of the location and timing went, the more small details began to undermine the initial assumption, as the area where the item was found had been passed through during prior searches, yet no one had noted its presence at that time, raising the question of whether the item had been there from the start or only appeared after the search had taken place. When officers reviewed reports from previous search groups, they found that the path leading to this location had been checked at least once, though not thoroughly, and if the item had been there all along, it was highly likely it would have been noticed, especially given the heightened alertness of the search teams. This contradiction forced investigators to consider the possibility that the evidence had been moved or placed there at a later time, and this hypothesis, though hard to accept, began to explain some of the existing anomalies in the investigation. Evaluating the possibility of tampered evidence opened up a series of new questions, not only about Margaret and Michelle's journey, but also about the intervention of an intentional external factor, because if the item was not left randomly, someone must have accessed it, brought it to this location, and left it in a discreet enough way to avoid immediate detection. Investigators began analyzing the surrounding environment at the discovery site for signs of staging, from how the item was positioned on the ground, the degree of weather exposure, to whether it was obscured, and although there was no direct evidence of specific tampering, the overall small details gradually created the sense that this was not simply a coincidental find. The assumption that the two children had returned to the old area thus began to lose persuasiveness, as if they had truly come back instinctively. Leaving an item in this manner did not fully align with what was known about their habits, especially with no other signs of their presence in the area after the disappearance. The twist of this phase did not come from clear evidence, but from a shift in the investigators' own perspective, as they began to suspect that the evidence once seen as a major hope might actually be what was pulling the investigation off course. The possibility of a misdirection tactic, though unprovable, gradually entered the list of serious assumptions, as it explained both the late appearance of the item and how it led search teams back to already checked areas without results. In that context, Every decision related to this evidence carried a double-edged nature. Ignoring it risked missing a vital clue, but clinging to it too tightly meant they might be following a path someone had deliberately laid out to slow or derail the search. The tension between these two possibilities overshadowed the entire investigative direction at that time, pushing the search into a new phase where not only finding Margaret and Michelle was needed, but also decoding the motives and actions of the invisible factors, influencing how the pieces of the case were gradually being put together. The suspicion that the evidence might have been moved, and the possibility of a misdirection tactic, forced investigators to shift focus from tracing the children's path to identifying individuals who could have interfered with the chain of events. Because if someone was proactive enough to stage a clue, that person must have had access to the area, understood children's routines, and avoided drawing attention in the community. From these criteria, an initial list of suspicious individuals was compiled, not from complete strangers, but from faces that had appeared in the neighborhood, had legitimate reasons to be near where Margaret and Michelle disappeared, or had been indirectly mentioned in scattered prior statements. Among them, one individual quickly emerged as a potential suspect when multiple small pieces of information began to converge: their presence in the relevant time frame, familiarity with the area, and certain details in witness accounts that seemed to match their presence. Identifying the first suspect was not based on any direct evidence linking them to the children's disappearance, but on a chain of reasoning formed from intersections of opportunity, timing, and behavior, sufficient to justify opening a focused investigative direction. Investigators systematically checked the suspect's background, reviewing residence, employment, social relationships, and movement history during the incident period, while cross-referencing this information with the established timeline to find any inconsistencies that might suggest concealment or lying. The background check did not immediately uncover clear wrongdoing, but was also insufficient to fully rule them out, as gaps in the suspect's schedule overlapped with the timeframes the investigation was trying to clarify. This ambiguity made the suspect the center of attention, and investigators decided to accelerate the next step, comparing the suspect's image and identifying features with witness descriptions of strangers or people seen near the children on the day they vanished. Witness identification was conducted with the expectation that it would be the key step to strengthen or refute the suspicion, as significant matches would provide a stronger foundation for continuing in this direction. Some witnesses were invited to participate in controlled identifications, with options designed to minimize unconscious suggestion, but initial results were not as conclusive as hoped, with responses fluctuating between enough certainty to spark hope and hesitation that made conclusions fragile. Nevertheless, amid time pressure and the lack of other leads, the investigative team still decided to allocate significant resources to this suspect, viewing it as the most grounded direction at the time. The focused investigation included not only deeper interrogations, but also expanding to track the suspect's connections, checking places they frequented, and searching for any signs they might have removed the children from the initial area unnoticed. During this process, some new details emerged that seemed to reinforce initial suspicions, such as minor inconsistencies in the suspect's explanation of their activities that day or information gaps they could not convincingly fill. These details, though not enough for evidence, created a logically coherent narrative, leading many investigators to believe they were getting closer to the answer. However, the intense focus on a single suspect also exposed an inherent weakness in the investigation, as pouring too many resources into one direction gradually narrowed the ability to objectively consider alternative hypotheses. The twist of this phase began to form when witness identification results were re-examined more carefully, and details once thought to support suspicion showed signs of unreliability. Some witnesses admitted influence from community discussions or the investigative process itself, meaning the image they remembered might have been distorted over time and expectation. When additional identifications were conducted under stricter conditions, certainty levels dropped significantly, and key matches lost their initial weight. Concurrently, deeper background and movement checks began revealing undeniable alibis, as certain time points were independently confirmed by unrelated sources, making their presence at critical locations less plausible. These findings did not come all at once but emerged gradually, forcing investigators to face the reality that the picture built around the first suspect was cracking. The decision to clear the suspect was not easy, as it meant admitting a large amount of time and resources had been spent on a fruitless direction, but investigative principles required placing evidence above assumptions. When all factors were synthesized, the conclusion became unavoidable. Initial identifications were not accurate enough to sustain suspicion, and indirect evidence once seen as questionable could not withstand independent verification. The twist of this part concluded with the collapse of the first suspect, as the name once viewed as the key to the case was removed from the suspect list, leaving a large void in the investigation, and a heavy sense that what seemed like clear progress was actually another cycle of hope and disappointment. Clearing the first suspect left a hard-to-fill void in the investigation, and that very void forced investigators to return to what remained after multiple sweeps: the nature of the disappearance itself. As assumptions based on mistaken identifications and ambiguous evidence were gradually set aside, a core question took center stage: whether Margaret and Michelle could have vanished spontaneously, or whether all signs pointed to organized intervention from the start. Behavioral analysis became the new focus, because if the children showed no panic, left no signs of struggle, and no witnesses heard cries for help, it was highly likely they left the area in a relatively orderly state, which would be difficult if they had simply wandered off for an extended period. Investigators compared this behavior to known patterns in children of similar ages, and reached a tentative conclusion that two children disappearing together without drawing attention required a certain level of situational control, typically only present when an adult intervened and guided them. From there, the abduction hypothesis was elevated from a parallel possibility to the primary investigative direction, not due to direct evidence, but because all other directions had gradually lost persuasiveness. When this hypothesis was seriously placed on the table, the entire view of the case shifted accordingly, as instead of asking where the children went, investigators began asking who could have taken them, how, and for how long without detection. The possibility of rapid vehicular movement was brought into analysis, as if Margaret and Michelle were removed from the area quickly, a vehicle would explain why expanding searches never encountered their traces. Surrounding roads were re-examined with a different perspective, not just for child traces, but to assess ease of quick departure, routes leading out of the neighborhood, low-traffic thoroughfares, and intersections where a vehicle could stop briefly without suspicion. This re-examination was not based on specific evidence, like tire marks, or direct statements, but on reconstructing the 1955 Connecticut traffic context, a time when vehicle volume was not heavy, and neighborhood comings and goings faced far less oversight than modern standards. Investigators also considered that if a vehicle was involved, it might not belong to a complete stranger, but to someone familiar in the community, with legitimate reasons to appear nearby without raising alarms. And this hypothesis circled back to initial suspicions that the incident was not merely impulsive. However, as widespread road departure checks were implemented, a major limitation quickly surfaced: the near-total absence of federal data to support interstate movement tracking. In 1955, information-sharing systems among law enforcement agencies were fragmented, with no centralized vehicle databases, no traffic cameras, and tracing a vehicle's journey beyond local scope relied almost entirely on chance witness statements. Investigators sent alerts and assistance requests to neighboring areas, but responses were mostly formal, as there was no specific information to match, and asking other states to search for the children without accurate vehicle or companion descriptions quickly reached a deadlock. This data shortage made the abduction hypothesis, though increasingly logical behaviorally, harder than ever to prove, as every expansion effort hit an invisible wall of technological and administrative limits of the era. To compensate for these limitations, investigators revisited timelines once more, this time aiming to determine the shortest possible window in which the children could have been removed, and thus infer maximum travel radius. However, the deeper the analysis, the more they realized that timeline gaps, already problematic from the start, now posed even greater barriers, as even a small timing discrepancy could completely alter the search map. Reconstruction efforts became fragile when relying on conflicting statements and uncertain memories, and though investigators tried building multiple parallel scenarios, none could be bolstered by concrete evidence. The twist of this phase emerged when the last remaining clues once held as backup hopes gradually vanished, not because they were disproven but because there was nothing left to pursue. Tips about suspicious vehicles could not be verified, assumed departure routes led to no new discoveries, and limited interstate contacts yielded no additional information. The investigation fell into a state where every path led to the same troubling conclusion. If Margaret and Michelle had been abducted and removed in the first hours, the act was executed quickly enough, discreetly enough, and in favorable enough conditions to erase nearly all traces. The complete disappearance of clues related to the abduction hypothesis not only weakened this direction, but also confronted investigators with a harsher reality, that even if they were correct about the case's nature, proving it with available tools was slipping out of reach. In that atmosphere, the abduction hypothesis persisted as a logical but unverifiable explanation, hanging between reason and helplessness, and this very suspension marked a subtle turning point in the investigation, as from then on, every advance depended not only on finding new clues, but also on acknowledging that what was lost might never be recreated through the traditional investigative methods of that era. From the helpless, suspended state of the abduction hypothesis, the investigation entered a phase that was both fragile and urgent, where any remaining information, even if it arrived late, was seen as the final opportunity to hold on to the possibility of finding Margaret and Michelle. Just a few weeks after the abduction direction gradually fell into an evidentiary void, a late witness statement emerged from a resident living on the edge of the area, who previously hadn't thought what they saw was relevant, but now, as the story was repeatedly mentioned in the press and community meetings, old memories suddenly became suspicious. This statement was not definitive. It was merely a vague observation of two children standing near a familiar turnoff around noon on the day of the disappearance, accompanied by an adult whom the witness could not clearly describe, but the appearance of this detail was enough to make the investigators pause all other directions and return to the starting point. Though aware of the risks of relying on delayed memories, they still decided to treat it as a lead that needed verification, because at that point, there was no better option. The decision to return to the old scene was made not only because of the new statement, but also in the hope that re-examining it with fresh eyes, after weeks of analysis, might reveal details that had been overlooked in the initial chaotic days. The scene, which had already been disturbed by previous searches, was now approached more cautiously, with the goal not of finding obvious traces, but of confirming or ruling out the possibility that the two children had returned or passed through the area after the presumed time of disappearance. The investigators reconstructed the assumed route, based on the late statement, cross-referencing it with what was known about the children's travel habits and the vague timelines remaining in the records. The supplementary search was conducted on a more modest scale than previous ones, without the massive community participation of the early days, focusing instead on narrow areas, overlooked corners where a small detail could be decisive. However, the change in method did not yield the desired results, as every meter rescanned still revealed no new evidence that could confirm the late statement, and what was found was either already recorded or lacked sufficient basis for direct connection to the disappearance. The investigators gradually realized that the scene, after multiple interventions, no longer retained its original state, and any additional search efforts could only take place in a space already distorted by time and human activity. The absence of new evidence made the atmosphere in the investigation team heavier, as every passing hour without a discovery meant that the fragile hope just reignited continued to fade. Nevertheless, they were still compelled to complete the verification of the late statement thoroughly, because ignoring it would mean accepting that no leads remained unchecked. When the cross-referencing of statements, the scene, and the timeline concluded, the unavoidable conclusion gradually became clear: the late statement lacked sufficient reliability to open a new investigative direction, and all efforts around it produced no substantial progress. The twist of this phase did not lie in discovering a shocking truth, but in the absolute silence of the results, as the entire chain of actions seen as the last hope ended in complete deadlock. The investigation, after pouring all remaining resources into a fragile lead, was forced to confront the reality that there was nothing left to pursue with existing methods, and continuing at the same pace would only prolong exhaustion without yielding more information. In that context, the investigators had to admit they had reached the limit of what could be done at that time, and though no one was ready to say it aloud, the general feeling was that the case was gradually slipping out of control, not due to lack of effort, but due to the absence of necessary pieces to connect all hypotheses into a complete picture. This deadlock was not just a temporary halt in the investigation, but a moment marking a profound psychological shift, when hope was no longer sustained by new leads, but existed only as a vague belief that somewhere, beyond the scope of what could be controlled, the answer still existed, though no one knew how to reach it. From the complete deadlock of the final effort, the investigation entered a phase of evaluation and closure, not with a clear conclusion, but with a collective acknowledgement that all feasible directions had been exhausted to their limits. The investigators gathered the entire file, from the initial contradictory statements, the large-scale searches that gradually narrowed, the unidentified physical evidence, to the unverifiable abduction hypothesis, to conduct a systematic overall review. The goal of this phase was no longer to find an immediate answer, but to determine whether any investigative direction had not been reasonably considered, and whether maintaining an active investigation status still held practical value. As each aspect was re-examined, a cold reality gradually emerged. Every assumption was based on fragmented pieces of information. No hypothesis could be strengthened with evidence strong enough for further legal steps, and all expansion efforts had encountered the same barrier of lacking foundational data. The limitations of the era, from identification technology, the ability to federalize information, to near-total reliance on witness memories, prevented the file from developing further in any traditional direction. In lengthy internal meetings, the investigators debated not who was right or wrong, but how continuing to pursue an investigation without leads could harm resources and the victims' families' expectations. The accumulated fatigue after months of continuous work without concrete results made the decision heavier, as no one wanted to be the one to say that this case, at least under current conditions, could not progress further. However, it was the frankness in the evaluation that led to the pivotal decision to actively close the file, not because they believed the case was resolved, but because acknowledging that keeping it open without new directions only created an illusion of progress. This decision was recorded in internal documents, emphasizing that the file would be fully preserved, ready for reopening if new information emerged, but all active investigative activities would be suspended. The transition in case status did not happen abruptly, but was a prolonged administrative and psychological process, as investigators had to face the family to explain that no further specific steps could be taken at that time. This moment marked a fundamental change in how the case was viewed, from an urgent search to a long-term missing persons case, where time became the central factor, and also the greatest enemy. When the case status was updated, Margaret and Michelle were officially classified as long-term missing children, a technical categorization carrying heavy emotional weight, as it acknowledged that short-term searching had failed, and the possibility of reunion, if any, lay in an uncertain future. The children's files were standardized according to archiving criteria, with detailed descriptions of their appearance at the time of disappearance, family background, and the entire course of the investigation, not for immediate actions, but to ensure that if new leads ever appeared, all necessary information would be ready. The shift to cold case status also brought changes in public attention. As news reports became sparse, community meetings were no longer held regularly, and the case receded from the spotlight to become a painful but fading memory in daily life. For the investigators, this was not a liberating end, but a prolonged suspension, as even though the file was procedurally closed, the core question remained unanswered. Many of them continued to carry this case as a professional haunting, a testament to the limits of investigative capabilities in a specific era, and to the fragility of assumptions without tools for verification. Organizationally, classifying the case as cold meant it would only be revisited with new information, usually from external sources, rather than proactive agency activities. This status turned the case into a dormant entity in the system, not disappearing, but also not progressing, existing like a time-sealed file. For the family, the transition held entirely different meaning, as it marked the moment when hope was no longer sustained by specific actions, but existed only as personal belief, unsupported by any tangible investigative process. Classifying the two children as long-term missing affirmed nothing about their fate, but forced everyone involved to adapt to a new reality, where the question was no longer when they would be found, but whether they ever would be. In the record system, the case of Margaret and Michelle was labeled as an unsolved cold case, a dry classification hiding behind it a series of efforts, mistakes, hopes, and disappointments. Closing the active investigation phase did not erase what had been done, but froze it in a state of indefinite waiting, where only time and unpredictable changes in the outside world could bring a chance for change. And it was in that moment, when all investigative paths had been exhausted, that the case officially left the present to enter a long stretch of history, where it existed not as a concluded story, but as an open question, silently lying there, awaiting something no one could yet name. When the case officially left active investigation status and was pushed back into the silence of a cold case, the story did not end there, because elsewhere, completely separate from the sealed files and dry evaluation meetings, the lives of the two children continued under entirely different conditions. Margaret and Michelle, though no longer called by those names, began existing in a new reality, where their identities were thoroughly replaced from the very first days. The new names assigned to them held no family meaning or memories, but were simply tools for blending into an unfamiliar environment, where no one knew about the disappearance of two children in Connecticut, and no one questioned their origins. Under these new identities, the two children were introduced as siblings or distant relatives, depending on the circumstances, and the lack of a clear past was explained with simple stories, enough to quell the curiosity of those around them, but not enough to build true security. The new living environment they were placed in did not feature overt violence or obvious chaos, but was shaped by tight control and unspoken rules they were forced to follow. These were spaces where silence was considered necessary, where asking too much was seen as inappropriate, and where the two children learned that their existence depended on adaptability rather than the right to question. All old habits, from how they addressed each other, reacted to adults, to small daily behaviors, had to be adjusted to fit the new context, and this process occurred not as a choice, but as a survival requirement. One of the biggest and most dangerous issues for their future was the absence of valid birth records, because in the administrative system, existing without legal papers meant always standing on the margins of society. Those responsible for the children's presence found ways to bypass procedures through informal methods, sometimes relying on the laxness of the system at the time, sometimes on constant movement to avoid deep scrutiny. The lack of birth records not only prevented the two children from fully accessing basic services, but also reinforced the feeling that they were temporary individuals, not allowed to attach too deeply to any place. In that environment, adaptation did not happen naturally, but was forced, as any deviation could lead to unpredictable consequences. The two children learned to observe before acting, to adjust their speech to meet the expectations of surrounding adults, and to hide vague memories of a previous life they were no longer allowed to mention. For the older child, memories of the old family existed as scattered fragments, not clear enough to reconstruct, but not faint enough to disappear, and this conflict created a tense psychological state, where past and present constantly clashed. The younger child, with fewer memories and limited expression, adapted faster behaviorally, but that did not mean no trauma, as absolute dependence on the new environment meant all experiences were shaped by others. In the early years under the new identities, the two children were not encouraged to build relationships outside the narrow scope of the substitute family, and interacting with strangers always came with supervision, or discreet reminders not to say too much. This instability made the concept of home vague, not tied to a specific place, but to avoiding trouble and maintaining outward normalcy. Though there was no clear physical abuse, the new living environment was characterized by constant psychological control, where the two children understood that their safety depended on adhering to prefabricated stories. These stories, initially just simple explanations for their existence, gradually became the foundation of a new identity, repeated enough to become familiar, but never enough to fully replace the nameless sense of loss. The lack of valid birth records also kept the two children in a vulnerable state before the system, as just one strict check or untimely question could collapse the fragile structure of their new identities. This created silent pressure, making movement, changing living environments, or avoiding key administrative milestones part of the survival strategy. In this early phase, the two children had no clear concept of having been abducted or hidden, as those words did not exist in their permitted world, but the feeling that something was wrong was always present, manifesting in excessive vigilance, vague fear when the past was mentioned, and an intense need to please those in control. Forced adaptation was not just learning to live in a new environment, but a process of restructuring themselves to fit a story not of their choosing, and that process left deep scars, even if not easily visible from the outside. While the official case file lay dormant in storage cabinets, marking the two children as long-term missing, they themselves were growing up in a legal and emotional void, where identity was stripped away, and the future shaped by decisions made long before. The early phase of life under new identities brought no true sense of relief or safety, but only the continuation of a passive state, where existence depended on adapting to unchangeable conditions, and where all memories of a once existing family had to be pushed deep down, not because they were no longer important, but because remembering could become a danger. From the earliest years of being forced to adapt under new identities, the lives of the two children gradually stabilized in appearance, but became increasingly constricted in essence, as all daily activities were organized within a closed framework designed to minimize to the greatest extent possible any risks that could expose the truth. Their living space, though it changed over time and location, was always maintained in a state of relative isolation, where daily activities followed a fixed schedule, with minimal social contact and virtually no free relationships outside the permitted scope. Attending school, if it occurred, was carefully considered and often accompanied by pre-prepared explanations to avoid drawing attention, while extracurricular activities or spontaneous interactions with peers were restricted to the absolute minimum. The closed-off lifestyle was not just a preventive measure, it gradually became the foundation of their way of living, where safety was traded for the loss of the normal experiences of childhood. In that environment, the rule of silence was established not through direct threats, but through the repeated delivery of seemingly harmless reminders that carried significant psychological weight, that there were things that should not be mentioned, questions that did not need answers, and memories that were best left undisturbed. The two children learned that stability depended on keeping the past secret, and that any slip in words could lead to consequences, even though no one specified what those consequences were. The rule of silence gradually seeped into their thinking, making self-censorship a reflex, and telling the truth, even to themselves, increasingly difficult over time. The process of severing the past did not happen in a single moment, but as a series of small yet continuous adjustments, from no longer mentioning old names, not keeping objects with memorial significance, to constructing new stories about origins and substitute family, repeated enough times to become default responses. For the older child, this severance caused a prolonged internal conflict, as faint images of the previous life occasionally resurfaced, not clear enough to confirm but strong enough to create a sense of loss, while the younger child gradually accepted the new reality as obvious, since its past was shrouded in a memory void. Severing the past was not only to hide the truth from outsiders, but also to restructure the perception of the two children themselves, so that they no longer questioned what had been taken away. Dependence on the guardian in this context became absolute, not just materially but also emotionally and cognitively, as the guardian was the sole source of information, rules and validation. Every decision, large or small, from where to go, whom to meet, to how to think about oneself, was shaped through the lens of that dependent relationship. The two children learned to anticipate the guardian's wishes, adjust their behavior to fit, and avoid expressions that might be seen as disobedient or troublesome, since the stability of their lives depended directly on maintaining the satisfaction of the person in control. In that context, the concept of personal choice barely existed, and childhood, instead of being a period of exploration and freedom, became a process of learning to adapt to invisible limits. Negative emotions, if they arose, were often not acknowledged or explained, but pushed inward, as expressing them offered no clear benefit. Over time, the closed-off lifestyle, the rule of silence, the severance of the past, and the dependent relationship blended together, forming a tightly controlled yet sophisticated structure, where the two children could exist without drawing attention, but had no space to develop an independent identity. Their childhood passed in a state of outward safety, but lacking naturalness, where all joy had to stay within permitted boundaries, and all questions were blocked before they could fully form. While the official case file remained dormant as a cold case, mentioned increasingly less in the outside world, it was this ongoing control that silently shaped the people the two children became. Not through dramatic events, but through the accumulation of small, repeated restrictions day after day. A controlled childhood left no obvious marks like violence or neglect, but it created a lasting void in life experiences, where freedom and safety never coexisted, and where growing up meant learning to exist in silence. From a childhood tightly controlled, where every behavior and word had to stay within permitted limits, the subsequent years of the two children began to reveal silent, but increasingly evident cracks in the identity structure they were living under. As they entered stages requiring more official presence in the social system, the documents related to them started showing inconsistencies, not in a way that immediately drew attention, but as small details repeated enough to create a prolonged sense of unease. The basic documents, though carefully constructed, still bore traces of patchwork, with information not fully consistent across sources, from names, places of birth, to important timelines. Those around them rarely asked deep questions, as everything appeared to function smoothly on the surface, but for the two children themselves, this lack of consistency gradually became something hard to ignore. Date of birth, a factor seemingly simple and fixed, was the most prominent point of contradiction, as what was recorded on paper did not fully match what they were told in the substitute family. This discrepancy started as just a number, but over time, it became a symbol of something deeper, that the story about themselves did not have a single version, and that the truth could change depending on the circumstances. The inability to clearly verify origins left every question about background in a suspended state, not decisively answered, but also not completely denied. Each time the two children, especially the older one, tried to learn more about their own past, the responses they received were often evasive, presented as unimportant details or stories told too many times and unnecessary to repeat. This evasion did not carry a confrontational tone, but was expressed through skillful redirection of the conversation, reminders to focus on the present, or emphasis that the past could not be changed. However, that very lack of transparency increased the feeling that something was wrong, and that the avoided questions were not meaningless, but touched on a part of the truth not allowed to be exposed. Over time, the identity gaps no longer existed only on paper, but began directly affecting how the two children viewed themselves and their place in the world. Lacking a clear origin made it difficult for them to build a coherent personal narrative, and the conflict between what was lived and what was recorded created a prolonged internal tension. To the outside system, these inconsistencies might just be administrative errors or consequences of frequent moves, but to those involved, they were signs of an identity constructed rather than born. Questions about who they were, where they came from, and why there could be no clear answers gradually became private thoughts, not easy to share, and not easy to dismiss. Avoided questions did not disappear but accumulated, each time pushed aside, deepening the distance between what was allowed to be known and what was hidden. In that context, the two children learned to live with uncertainty as a normal part of life, accepting that there were things about themselves they could not verify, and that digging deeper could lead to unwanted disruptions. However, this acceptance did not mean peace, as the identity gaps always lingered like small cracks on the surface, not large enough to collapse the entire structure, but enough to ensure it was never completely solid. While the outside world viewed them as ordinary individuals with valid histories on paper, inside, the feeling of an incomplete self became increasingly clear, and the contradiction between what was recorded and what was felt became an inseparable part of the life experience. Those gaps did not immediately lead to specific actions or changes, but they silently laid the foundation for a prolonged state of doubt, where each mismatched detail reminded them that the current identity might only be a shell, covering a deeper truth yet to be named. From the identity gaps becoming increasingly evident in the late teenage years, the maturation process of the two children unfolded like a series of cautious steps in the fog, where each decision was made with the goal of avoiding collision rather than pursuing self-discovery. Leaving the old environment did not happen at a specific moment or in the form of a clear farewell, but as a gradual separation, as the connection to the living space and guardians became looser in pace with growing up. This departure did not resemble freedom or a new beginning, but rather a continued survival strategy, aimed at reducing direct supervision while still maintaining a safe distance from any factors that could lead to tracing origins. As they entered the stage requiring more independence, the two children, now young adults, were forced to learn how to exist in society without relying on the familiar structures of family or community, but also unable to fully rely on the official system, which always carried the risk of exposing inconsistencies in personal records. In that context, avoiding the administrative system was no longer just a habit formed from vague fear, but became an intentional way of life, influencing how they chose paths in education, work, and residence. Procedures requiring deep identity verification, records demanding clear personal history or continuity of documents, were approached with high vigilance and often delayed, circumvented, or replaced with less binding options. This avoidance did not stem from a desire to defy rules, but from accumulated experience that any scrutiny could open a chain of questions they were unable to answer consistently. Over time, that avoidance strategy created invisible limits in life, narrowing career choices, making long-term development opportunities fragile, and keeping a sense of insecurity present whenever facing unavoidable official procedures. Alongside avoiding the system, the inaccessibility to personal history continued as an unfillable void, even as the need to understand themselves became more urgent upon entering adulthood. Unlike children, adults could not easily accept vague stories as sufficient explanations, but when trying to dig deeper, they faced a wall of silence or fragmented information that could not be pieced into a coherent narrative. Without accurate birth records to cross-reference, without relatives willing or able to confirm key details, and without clear enough memories to reconstruct it themselves, their personal history existed as a blank space, surrounded by unverified assumptions. The inability to access the past not only caused temporary curiosity or concern, but also directly affected how they shaped their identity, as every effort to answer "who am I" lacked the basic foundation of "where do I come from." In that context, the past was not completely forgotten, but also not allowed to be clearly present, making it a factor causing simmering tension, both driving and restraining the process of self-awareness. At the same time, the relationship with the original family, already severed since early childhood, was not reconnected, but gradually became an abstract concept, lacking concrete form in their mental life. The original family did not exist as a place to return to, or as clear memories to reminisce about, but only appeared as unanswered questions and nameless feelings of loss. This separation was not the result of an active decision, but the consequence of years living under conditions where seeking roots was seen as dangerous or futile. Upon maturing, that distance did not naturally narrow but instead became harder to bridge, as time had blurred the few remaining clues and made starting a search journey psychologically burdensome. Maturing in ambiguity meant learning to accept that their identity might never be fully confirmed, and that the lack of clarity was an inseparable part of life. The two children, now adults, built relationships and individual paths based on what they could control in the present, avoiding commitments requiring absolute transparency to maintain the fragile stability they had struggled to achieve. However, that stability always came with a profound sense of lack, as no matter how integrated they became, there remained a gap between the person they were and the person they might have become if the past had not been shrouded in silence and avoidance. Leaving the old environment, avoiding the administrative system, inaccessibility to personal history, and complete separation from the original family blended together, creating an incomplete state of maturity where identity was formed through continuous adaptation rather than full understanding. In that state, life continued no longer under direct control as in childhood, but also without true freedom, existing in an intermediate zone where each step forward was carefully weighed to avoid accidentally touching unresolved questions. From a state of maturity in ambiguity, where life is built on choices of avoidance and fragile stability, doubts about oneself begin to emerge, not as fleeting feelings, but as a prolonged and uncontrollable psychological process. Fragmented childhood memories, once pushed aside to adapt to the present, now gradually return in unpredictable ways, appearing in everyday moments as incomplete images, vague sounds, or familiar sensations not tied to any specific context. These memory fragments are not clear enough to confirm anything, but distinct enough that they cannot fully integrate with the life story they have been told, creating a subtle disconnect between inner experience and recognized reality. As maturity increases, the ability to analyze and compare develops, making it harder to ignore mismatched details, and those fragmented memories begin to be seen not as products of imagination, but as traces of an obscured past. Alongside this, the feeling of not belonging becomes increasingly clear, not in an explosive or dramatic way, but as a persistent background state, present in relationships, work environments, and the social spaces they participate in. Even though they may integrate behaviorally, performing social roles flawlessly, an invisible distance remains between them and those around them, as if they are always on the sidelines of a shared story they are not fully part of. This feeling is hard to name, as it is not tied to a specific event or act of rejection, but stems from a lack of synchronization between their inner world and the context, between what they feel and what is expected. In family gatherings or moments requiring deep connection, the sense of not belonging becomes more evident, making them both present and detached, participating but not fully attached. When comparing themselves to their adoptive or substitute family, this difference becomes harder to ignore, not just in superficial details like appearance or habits, but in emotional responses to situations, attachment to shared memories, and sharing a recognized history. The adoptive family has stories retold over and over, collective memories that create natural bonds among members, while they can only participate in those stories as listeners, not experiencers. This comparison does not necessarily lead to resentment or confrontation, but it highlights the absence of a common foundation, making them realize they stand in a different position, even if no one says it. These differences, accumulated over time, begin to transform into questions about identity, no longer just vague inquiries about the past but an internal reasoning process, where fragmented pieces are gradually placed side by side to seek an overall shape. They begin to wonder whether inconsistencies in documents, evasive answers, the feeling of not belonging, and vague memories are isolated signs or manifestations of the same unnamed truth. This doubt does not appear as a spontaneous thought, but forms through multiple stages, each triggered by a new experience or comparison, making the question of identity increasingly specific. However, confronting this doubt directly comes with a vague fear, because if the assumption is that the current identity does not reflect the truth, digging deeper could collapse the entire stable structure they have built. This very contradiction between the need to know and the need to maintain the status quo creates a prolonged state of tension, where the doubt cannot be extinguished but also cannot be resolved immediately. In this process, fragmented childhood memories act as incomprehensible signals, both suggestive and disruptive, as they provide no clear information but carry enough emotional weight to be impossible to ignore. Incomplete images of a different space, familiar sensations with things that do not exist in the present, and emotional reactions disproportionate to the current situation gradually come to be seen as indirect evidence that a part of the past has been separated from the official story. The feeling of not belonging, once explained as a consequence of frequent moves or personal differences, is now placed in a new context, where it becomes a sign of a deeper rupture in the flow of identity. When comparing themselves to the adoptive family, the differences are no longer just subjective feelings, but reinforced by specific details like the lack of shared memory milestones, awkwardness when mentioning origins, and differences in attachment to family traditions. All these elements, when placed together, gradually form a more structured doubt about identity, though not yet with enough data to confirm or deny. This doubt is not widely shared, because voicing it means acknowledging that the current life may be built on an unstable foundation, and that those around them, even without ill intent, may have contributed to maintaining a story that is not entirely true. Thus self-doubt becomes a discrete inner journey, unfolding in silence, where every detail is carefully weighed and every assumption kept temporary. In this state, they do not actively seek answers, but they can no longer completely ignore the question, as the doubt has become part of how they view themselves. Part 13 ends at the point where the doubt is no longer a vague feeling, but has become a thought structure, not clear enough to act on, but strong enough to change how they understand their life, laying the psychological foundation for deeper shifts in perception, even though at that time, they themselves could not yet envision the consequences of beginning to doubt their own identity. From a state of prolonged self-doubt over many years, where all questions about identity were kept at the level of internal speculation, a change of an era quietly emerges and gradually creates an irreversible turning point: the widespread use of genealogical DNA technology in civilian life. Initially, submitting DNA to the system was not tied to the goal of uncovering a hidden past or solving a missing person case, but occurred as a normal personal action, stemming from the desire to understand more about biological origins, health history, or ancestral lineage. In the context of modern society, sending a DNA sample for analysis no longer carries special or sensitive connotations, but has become a common choice, promoted as a harmless tool for self-discovery. This very normality means the step is not accompanied by great expectations and is not seen as an action capable of shaking the entire identity structure that has existed for decades. However, when the DNA sample is entered into the system and begins to be compared with the ever-expanding genealogical database, the results quickly reveal abnormalities that cannot be explained by sentiment or vague memories as before. Blood connections appear clearly, shown through matching percentages exceeding the threshold for ordinary distant relationships, indicating the existence of biological relatives never known. Notably, these connections do not fall within the current family, or any branch ever mentioned in the pre-established origin story, but lead to completely unfamiliar individuals living in different areas, with family histories having no clear intersection with the known life. The discovery of blood connections does not come as a complete answer, but as a series of consistent yet fragmented signals, each reinforcing the assumption that the true biological identity was separated from the legal identity very early on. As results continue to update and cross-reference, the mismatch with the current family becomes undeniable, as DNA data excludes the possibility of direct or close indirect blood relation, something previously either tacitly accepted or never verified. This exclusion is not emotional, comes without explanation or context, but is presented with cold, precise probability numbers, making it more convincing than any fragmented memory or feeling of not belonging that appeared before. At this point, inconsistencies in documents, mismatched birth dates, evaded questions, and prolonged feelings of disconnect begin to be viewed in a completely different light, no longer as random administrative errors or consequences of frequent moves, but as signs linked in a chain of intentional causes. Genealogical DNA acts as the final catalyst, turning personal doubts into an objectively verifiable possibility, and more importantly, one that can be traced back. When the possibility of not sharing blood with the current family is confirmed, the question no longer stops at something is wrong, but shifts to what really happened. It is at this point that the abduction possibility, hypothesis once raised in the old investigation then abandoned for lack of evidence, suddenly returns with entirely new weight. If the biological identity does not match, if there is no valid birth record, if the past was systematically hidden, then being removed from the original family is no longer a speculative scenario, but a possibility to be seriously considered using modern investigative tools. Genealogical DNA not only opens the direction to identify the biological family, but also reframes the entire context of the past disappearance, turning what seemed like a dormant cold case into a story with potential continuation. The newly discovered blood connections suggest that somewhere there still exist flesh and blood relatives who may have lived their whole lives with an unsolved loss, and that the disappearance years ago did not end in death or accident, but in a separation lasting decades. The emergence of DNA data also changes the position of those involved, from individuals carrying secret doubts to those with scientific basis, to ask legitimate questions about their past. No longer vague feelings or hard-to-explain intuition, but numbers, charts, and confirmed blood relationships, forcing all old assumptions to be re-examined. The major twist of this phase does not lie in immediately finding the true identity, or clearly determining criminal behavior, but in the fundamental shift of the entire story, when modern science provides a new language to interpret what was once covered by silence and time. What previously could not be proven now becomes comparable data, and hypotheses once dismissed for lack of evidence now face the opportunity for serious, systematic re-evaluation. Genealogical DNA does not bring immediate liberation, but opens a door to a series of new, deeper, and harder questions. But for the first time in decades, those questions no longer fall into the void. Part 14 ends at the moment when the truth, though not complete, has stepped out of ambiguity to become a specific possibility, where the case once filed as a cold case is no longer just a painful memory of the past, but a story standing on the threshold of being reopened under the light of modern science and data. From the moment genealogical DNA data breaks the decades-long ambiguity, the search for truth no longer takes place in the inner space or isolated personal reasoning, but enters a new phase of systematic comparison, where two seemingly separate timelines begin to be placed side by side for alignment. The 1955 missing person file, once closed as a cold case, is pulled from storage with a completely different purpose than before, not to search for new clues at the old scene, but to directly cross-reference with current data, gradually revealing the true biological origin. Information once seen as dry administrative details, date of disappearance, age at the time of vanishing, physical description, family relationships, and social context, is carefully reviewed again. This time not to determine the initial investigation direction, but to seek matches with what genealogical DNA is suggesting. When timelines are placed in parallel, age compatibility becomes the first notable factor, as the gap between the estimated birth year in the missing person file and current biological age creates no inexplicable contradiction, but instead falls within a reasonable range, considering administrative discrepancies and long-term identity changes. Old file physical descriptions, though subjective and limited by era tools, begin to show noteworthy similarities when compared to current genetic traits. From hard-to-change facial structures to biological features less affected by environment. This match is not enough for independent proof, but significantly strengthens the assumption that the two timelines, one starting from the 1955 disappearance, one continuing under a new identity, are actually two parts of the same story. As the comparison continues, historical discrepancies once puzzling in the current life begin to find more reasonable explanations when placed in the context of an abduction. Birth date contradictions, once seen as administrative errors or results of frequent moves, are now viewed as outcomes of intentionally blurring traces, as adjusting a few birth years was enough to sever direct links to the missing person file without drawing attention in a system lacking cross-checking capabilities, like mid-20th century decades. The absence of a valid birth record is no longer an unexplained anomaly, but a detail fitting the scenario of two children removed from their original family, without any legal procedure. Gaps in personal history, periods with unverifiable residence or guardianship, when placed in the overall timeline, gradually emerge as necessary silences for the new identity to solidify and the past to be buried. The process of explaining historical discrepancies does not aim to legitimize a new story, but to test whether the contradictions can be strung into a logical sequence, and the result shows they do not exist randomly, but tend to converge around the same starting point of 1955. When these data are placed next to the original investigation file, assumptions once raised then abandoned for lack of evidence begin to be re-examined from a different angle. The abduction hypothesis, once deemed unprovable due to lack of federal data and technological limits, is now bolstered by a chain of consistent indirect evidence, with genealogical DNA serving as the central connector of fragmented pieces. The two timelines intersect not at a single point, but through multiple overlapping layers, from biological, administrative to lived experience, each layer alone, not convincing enough, but combined forming a logical structure, hard to fully dismiss. Strengthening the abduction hypothesis does not occur as a sudden conclusion, but as an accumulative process, where each successful comparison reduces the viability of alternative scenarios. The possibility of the two children voluntarily leaving their original family becomes inconsistent with their age at disappearance, while assumptions of accident or death fail to explain continuous existence under a different identity for decades. The intersection of the two timelines thus carries not only personal meaning for those involved, but also clear investigative value, as it provides a new reference frame to re-understand the entire case from start to finish. What was once seen as the end of a search is now viewed as the beginning of another story, where disappearance does not mean termination, but a forced transition to a different life. This comparison process also raises new questions about motive and method of the abduction, as maintaining the new identity, long-term, if the hypothesis is correct, requires not just temporary concealment, but a series of intentional decisions over many years. The two timelines intersect thus not only at the data level, but also at the meaning level, when the frozen past of a family who lost children and the ambiguous present of adults raised under a different identity suddenly meet at the same point, the delayed truth. When timelines, features, and historical discrepancies are placed in the same analytical frame, the abduction hypothesis is no longer a far-fetched guess, but the only explanation capable of encompassing all confirmed data. Part 15 ends at the moment when the two timelines, once parallel but never touching, now begin to intersect clearly, creating an overall picture where past and present no longer exist separately, but illuminate each other, laying a solid foundation for re-examining the 1955 case, not as a concluded story, but as a chain of events that never truly stopped. From the moment the two timelines of past and present began to clearly intersect, the 1955 disappearance could no longer be regarded as merely a historical file gathering dust in archives, and it was precisely the convergence of new evidence that created a sufficiently strong legal and operational basis to trigger the reopening of the case. The cold case unit took over the file in a completely different state compared to previous reviews, because this time, they did not start with the assumption that all leads had been exhausted, but with the awareness that what had once been considered the limits of the era could now be overcome, thanks to biological data, analytical technology, and experience accumulated from decades of investigating similar cases. The handover was not formalistic, but a full transfer process in which the entire original file, from the initial reports, witness statements, search maps, strategic decisions, to the reasons for closing the case, was brought to light for independent reassessment. The cold case unit approached the matter with a key principle, not assuming that previous conclusions were wrong, but also not taking them as correct by default, instead placing every detail in its specific historical context to determine the true value of each investigative decision. The review of the old file proceeded layer by layer, starting from the very first hours of the disappearance, when initial assumptions had shaped the entire subsequent direction, all the way to the stage when the case was classified as a cold case. The investigators reanalyzed how information was collected, how statements were recorded, and how contradictions were handled, not only to find overlooked clues, but to understand why certain investigative paths had been closed off too early. When historical decisions were placed alongside DNA data and compared with the modern timeline, historical investigative errors began to emerge more clearly, not as serious professional mistakes, but as subtle breaking points where assumptions had replaced evidence. Some witness statements, once considered foundational, now showed signs of being influenced by false memories, community pressure, or the lack of standardization in identification procedures at the time. Some pieces of evidence previously deemed unreliable gained significance when placed within the hypothesis of an organized abduction, particularly details related to movement away from the area and the late appearance of traces. The cold case unit also clearly determined that the lack of federal coordination in the 1950s had created gaps that could not be filled at the time, causing any hypotheses involving the rapid removal of the victims from the locality to reach a deadlock. This assessment was not intended to deny the efforts of predecessor investigators, but to precisely identify the limitations that had governed their decisions, thereby avoiding repetition of the same mindset in the modern context. As historical errors were systematized, the case began to be restructured as a chain of events that had never truly ended, rather than a story closed due to lack of leads. Parallel to the file review, the cold case unit had to prepare for the most sensitive and ethically complex step, approaching those believed to be the victims of the old case, now adults with lives, families, and separate identities built over decades. This preparation went beyond merely establishing legal authority. It also included assessing the potential psychological impact of reopening the past on those involved. The investigators had to consider an approach that was transparent enough to explain the reason for contact, yet cautious enough not to impose an unfully confirmed truth. They understood that an incorrect approach could cause severe identity shock, shatter the fragile sense of security the victims had built, and even lead them to refuse cooperation, disrupting the entire process of clarifying the truth. Therefore, the contact plan was built step by step, with consultation from psychological and legal experts to ensure that information was provided gradually, in context, and without placing the contacted individuals in a position of being forced to confront the full truth immediately. Reopening the cold case at this stage was no longer a purely investigative action, but became a delicate balancing process between the responsibility to uncover the truth and the duty to protect people from unnecessary harm. The cold case unit had to serve both as seekers of facts and managers of the consequences of bringing those facts to light after more than half a century buried. When the review of the old file was complete and historical errors were clearly identified, the case officially entered a new state, where the question was no longer whether to continue, but how to proceed in a responsible, accurate, and humane manner. Preparing to approach the victims became the convergence point of the entire reopening process, where modern science, historical analysis, and ethical considerations had to coexist in parallel. Because only when these three elements were balanced could the reopening of a cold case spanning more than half a century lead to the truth without leaving additional unhealable wounds. Immediately after the cold case unit completed the preparation for contact and established full legal, scientific, and ethical conditions, the identity confirmation process was activated as the pivotal step, shifting the entire case from a hypothetical state to a verified reality. The DNA samples analyzed in the previous stage were no longer viewed as a warning signal or potential clue, but were subjected to final verification with rigorous cross-checking procedures, including multi-point genetic comparison, exclusion of random coincidence, and matching with independent family tree branches. Forensic geneticists worked in parallel with investigators, completely separated from the historical file to ensure that scientific conclusions were not influenced by investigative expectations or emotional pressure accumulated over decades. When the final analysis results were returned, the match level was no longer in the realm of speculation, but reached a near-absolute probability threshold, sufficient to affirm direct blood relations between the two current adults and the biological family that had lost children in 1955. At this point, the DNA conclusion was not merely a table of data, but became the central evidence, completely shattering the assumption lasting more than half a century that the two children had died or disappeared forever. On the basis of this scientific conclusion, Connecticut state legal authorities began the statutory identity confirmation process, a procedure no less complex than a criminal investigation, as it directly involved adjusting personal status, citizenship rights, and legal history for two people who had lived under different identities for nearly their entire lives. The file passed through multiple levels of review, from the prosecutor's office, Vital Records Agency, to the competent court, to ensure that the confirmation did not create legal conflicts with pre-existing documents, even though those documents were determined not to reflect the original truth. Throughout this process, the focus was not on immediate prosecution, but on establishing a stable legal truth, allowing subsequent steps in the case to proceed without dispute. When the final legal decision was issued, the original identities of the two victims were officially restored in the judicial system, while the identities used for decades were recorded as false or imposed under unlawful circumstances. Parallel to the legal confirmation, law enforcement agencies updated the 1955 missing persons file, an action both symbolic and operational, marking the first time this file changed status after more than 50 years frozen. Instead of being classified as missing with unknown fate, or presumed deceased, the file was updated with confirmation that the two victims were alive, along with the confirmation date and accompanying scientific legal basis. This update served not only archival purposes, but also had the significance of revising the entire historical statistical chain regarding missing children in Connecticut during the 1950s, forcing relevant agencies to re-evaluate long-held assumptions about mortality rates, survival possibilities, and abduction patterns of that era. For the biological family, identity confirmation brought a complex emotional state, far beyond the concept of relief, because the truth that the two children were alive did not erase more than half a century of grief, but forced them to restructure all memories, beliefs, and the way they had lived with that pain. For the two victims themselves, identity confirmation was a pivotal moment, where lifelong vague doubts were suddenly replaced by a clear but far from easy-to-accept truth, as it raised fundamental questions about who they had been, what had been taken from them, and how their lives would be reinterpreted when the entire foundation of identity was overturned. However, within the scope of this part, the focus of the process lay not in individual emotional reactions, but in establishing an objective truth recognized by science and law, so the case could officially enter a new phase. When files were updated, legal decisions were signed and issued, and DNA conclusions were archived as official evidence, the 1955 disappearance case for the first time escaped ambiguity, shifting to an undeniable reality. The two victims were alive, identities confirmed, and their disappearance was no longer a question of whether it happened, but became questions of how it happened, and who was responsible. Identity confirmation closed the phase of seeking truth about the individuals while opening a deeper layer of issues, where the established truth would force the legal, investigative, and societal systems to confront the long-term consequences of a case overlooked for more than half a century. Immediately after the identities of the two victims were conclusively confirmed scientifically and legally, the entire focus of the case shifted from the system of files to specific individuals, and the next step became one of the most sensitive, complex, and decisive moments of the entire process, disclosing the truth to those who had been deprived of their identities for more than half a century. Approaching the victims was not viewed as a single action, but as a multi-layered process, starting with assessing their current living circumstances, mental state, social relationships, and the level of psychological stability each had built in a life under a different identity. The cold case unit clearly understood that, even though the truth had been confirmed, delivering it to the victims could not follow ordinary investigative logic, because these were not subjects for interrogation or witnesses, but people who had lived their entire lives within a different structure of reality, where all memories, relationships, and sense of self were built on a foundation that did not match the original truth. The approach was therefore carefully prepared, involving trauma psychology experts, with the goal not of informing them, but of creating conditions for the truth to be received without completely shattering the victim's ability to self-balance. The first contact did not take place in an official investigative setting, but in a neutral space, to avoid triggering defensive reflexes often associated with power and control, especially for those who had experienced a childhood of imposition and supervision. When the process of revealing true identity began, information was not presented as a complete declaration right away, but was laid out in logical layers, starting with objective facts that the victims themselves had doubted throughout their lives, then gradually connecting the pieces into a complete picture. The investigators proactively allowed silence, hesitation, and even denial reactions to occur, because they understood that these responses were not rejections of the truth, but the mind's self-defense mechanisms against information capable of collapsing the entire sense of self. The initial psychological reactions of the two victims were not dramatic or explosive, but manifested through subtler signs, pauses in thinking, repeated questions, skepticism mixed with an inexplicably familiar feeling, as scattered childhood memories suddenly found connections. For them, the truth was not just an answer to a lingering doubt, but a powerful collision between the person they believed themselves to be and the person they might have become if history had not been bent. The psychologists noted the simultaneous emergence of two opposing states, a sense of explanation, as lifelong identity unease finally had a clear cause, and a profound sense of loss, upon realizing that a portion of family life, origins, and memories had been irretrievably taken. In the hours and days immediately following disclosure, absolute priority was not placed on reinforcing the conclusion or pushing next steps in the case, but on psychological stabilization, helping the victims maintain a sense of agency over the new truth. There was no requirement to accept it immediately, no pressure to react according to societal expectations, and no assumption that knowing the truth equated to an immediate desire for reunion. Preparation for possible reunion was presented as an open prospect, not an inevitable conclusion, because the investigators were fully aware that reunion only held meaning when the victims had sufficient time and space to process their new identity. Information about the biological family was provided at a sufficient level, focusing on basic facts, avoiding deep emotional details that could overwhelm in the early stage. In parallel, a long-term support plan was developed, including psychological counseling, legal assistance, and step-by-step guidance for any personal status changes, to ensure that disclosing the truth did not become an isolated event, but the starting point of a controlled process. For the investigators, this was the moment they had to step back from the role of truth seekers and shift to protecting the truth from causing further harm, because they understood that a truth revealed at the wrong time or in the wrong way could have consequences as severe as concealing it. When the disclosure session ended, there was no definitive confirmation, no immediate decision on reunion or public disclosure, only a new reality placed into the lives of two people, heavy but irreversible. Within the scope of this part, disclosing the truth was not viewed as an emotional climax, but as a quiet yet profound turning point, where the entire story began to leave the world of files and evidence to enter the far more complex realm of memory, identity, and personal choice, laying the foundation for subsequent developments without haste or imposition. Because after more than 50 years, deprived of the right to know who they were, the two victims had finally been given back the truth in a way that allowed them to decide its meaning for the rest of their lives. After the truth about their identities had been revealed, and the two victims had been given initial time to process, stabilize, and understand that their lives had just been reset on an entirely different foundation, the next inevitable step was the meeting with their birth family. People who had lived for decades in a state of prolonged loss, holding on to hope while training themselves not to expect too much. The reunion was not organized as a symbolic event or a public moment, but prepared as a special psychological situation where every element had to be controlled to minimize pressure. A neutral space, limited duration, the discreet presence of a psychologist and a coordinator, and most importantly, the right to stop at any time if either side felt overwhelmed. The birth family was prepared in advance for a reality they both longed for and feared. The people they would meet were no longer the children from 1955, but two adults with voices, gazes, mannerisms, and a value system shaped in a different place. The two victims, in turn, were prepared for the fact that those facing them would carry a lifetime of waiting and might express intense emotions at a pace they were not ready to receive. When the meeting began, there was no instant recognition moment, like in idealized stories, because the biological truth had already been confirmed, so what needed to be overcome was not doubt, but the distance created by time. The first seconds were often shrouded in hesitation, glances searching for familiar features that might not exist, confusion over what terms to use to address each other, and the unnatural feeling of standing before people sharing the same blood, yet feeling like strangers. Confirmation of the relationship therefore did not happen through a decisive declaration, but through softer yet weighty signs, undeniable similarities in certain facial structures, the way eyebrows furrowed, the shape of hands, a small habit when silent or thinking, details that brought the birth family both pain and relief, because finally, something belonging to them was right in front of their eyes. However, even when those similarities appeared, they could not automatically replace a relationship severed too early, and it was precisely this disparity that created a sense of reunion that was incomplete from the start. In the initial conversation, everyone had to walk a fragile line. The birth family wanted to ask about the lost years, but feared causing pain. The two victims wanted to know their origins, but also feared that hearing too much would cause their current lives to collapse. The psychologist steered the exchange towards safer milestones, helping both sides realize that the goal at this point was not to tell everything, but to be able to stay in the same room without falling apart. When comparing memories and the present began, the fragmented childhood memories of the two victims were placed alongside the birth family's story, like puzzle pieces missing edges. Some fit unexpectedly, some did not fit at all, and there were gaps no one could fill. The birth family recounted the context of 1955, the habits of the two children, small details only close relatives would know, hoping it would pull memories back. The two victims responded with strange sensations, sometimes a stirring when a detail felt right, sometimes a chill when realizing they remembered nothing corresponding, and sometimes silent panic, because memories did not come on demand. There were particularly uncomfortable moments of comparison, when the birth family saw in the two victims traces of long-term trauma, and understood that they had not only lost their children to an abduction, but also lost their childhoods to a different life. Conversely, the two victims also had to face a different pain. They were not just regaining their birth family, but realizing that a part of themselves had been taken away forever, because they could not become the people the birth family had been waiting for. During the meeting, the DNA truth and legal confirmation created a solid foundation that they were blood-related, but that connection did not automatically create a sense of belonging, and this was the essence of the incomplete reunion. Correct biologically, correct legally, but emotionally lagging behind, or even going in the opposite direction. The birth family might want to embrace tightly, but feared overwhelming the victims. The victims might want to keep distance, but feared being seen as ungrateful. Every gesture was weighed. Every question could become an unintentional knife. The incompleteness also stemmed from the fact that the two victims did not have just one family in their current lives, but an entire network of relationships, habits, responsibilities, and identity built over decades, things that could not be erased, simply because the truth was acknowledged. This made the reunion impossible as a simple return, but more like an intersection between two parallel lives, where each side had to learn to coexist with the other's presence without completely negating the life already lived. During the meeting, the psychologists helped everyone set boundaries. no demands for promises, no pressure to confirm emotions, no goal of reconnecting immediately, but only focusing on creating a safe enough encounter to allow future meetings. At the end of the meeting, there was no clear emotional conclusion. Instead, there were signs that a truth had touched real lives. The birth family, left with a feeling of both relief and pain, because they finally knew their children were alive, but could not reclaim the lost time. The two victims left feeling as if they had just been pulled back to an origin they were not yet prepared for, while also having to protect their current lives from collapse. The reunion therefore did not close the pain, but made it more visible, because it showed that time had not only taken away the presence of loved ones, but also the version of them in memory. Within the scope of this part, the reunion is viewed as an honest confrontation with the consequences of a case spanning more than half a century. The truth brings light, but that light does not simplify everything. It clearly exposes the unfillable voids, forcing everyone to step into a new reality, where reunion is real, but never again whole as before. After the emotionally contradictory reunion, and the insurmountable limits imposed by time, the investigation process had to return to the core question that had hung suspended for more than half a century: who committed the kidnapping, and whether justice could still intervene. The review of prosecutorial possibilities was carried out systematically, not based on the emotions just stirred by the identity truth, but on the current legal framework, historical records, and what could still be proven in court. Prosecutors and cold case investigators together analyzed every hypothesis raised in the past, cross-referencing them with newly collected data from genetic genealogy, travel records, overlooked social connections from the 1950s, and individuals who had appeared on the fringes of the original investigation. However, the deeper they went, the more they had to confront a harsh reality. Time had not only blurred memories, but also dissolved the ability to pursue criminal responsibility in the traditional sense. The individuals once suspected, if still alive, either lacked direct evidence sufficient for charges, or had fallen into a state where their specific role in the chain of events could no longer be determined, as key witnesses had died, and physical evidence no longer existed. Many leads pointed to names that had faintly appeared in old files, but re-verification showed they had died long ago, taking with them any possibility of confrontation, interrogation, or motive confirmation. In other cases, involved individuals had disappeared from the system decades earlier, leaving gaps in records that could not be filled with speculation or inference, because modern legal standards do not allow conviction based on probability or moral sentiment. At the same time, the statute of limitations emerged as a structural barrier, independent of the moral severity of the act. Although child kidnapping is now viewed as a particularly serious crime, the legal framework at the time of the incident, and subsequent amendments, did not allow retroactive application to override long-expired limitations. This created a bitter paradox. The truth was finally clarified, at a point when the legal tools for punishment were no longer effective. Prosecutors had to acknowledge that, even if they could identify the most likely scenario of the kidnapping, and pinpoint moral responsibility, they still could not bring the case to trial without violating fundamental principles of the rule of law. Internal discussions became tense, because no one wanted to simply declare nothing more can be done, but neither could anyone legitimize an unsubstantiated prosecution just to satisfy societal or family emotional needs. In that context, the concept of incomplete justice began to be used as an honest way to name the current state of the case. The truth had been confirmed, the consequences acknowledged, but criminal accountability could not be enforced. This was not just a dry legal conclusion, but a heavy reality for everyone involved, especially the two victims, who had just regained their identities, only to simultaneously face the fact that the person who stole their childhoods would never be held accountable before the law. For the birth family, this feeling was even more complicated, as the reunion had barely begun to offer healing, when it was overshadowed by the realization that there would be no trial to officially name the crime and its perpetrator. The investigators could not escape a structural sense of failure, not due to lack of effort, but because a legal system designed to protect human rights in the present simultaneously set limits on addressing crimes from the distant past. In the final review process, every prosecutorial possibility was documented, analyzed, and officially ruled out in writing, leaving no gray area for misplaced future expectations. The file was updated with a special status, reflecting that the perpetrator, though possibly identifiable at an investigative level, could no longer be prosecuted due to death, untraceable disappearance, or expired statute of limitations. This documentation carried significance equal to confirming the victims' identities, as it put a period on one branch of the case, while forcing society to confront the uncomfortable but necessary question: what is justice when the law cannot intervene? Within the scope of this part, the case is not viewed as a complete failure of the system, but as clear evidence of the limits of criminal justice, where truth and accountability do not always meet at the right time. Acknowledging that the perpetrator cannot be prosecuted is not meant to downplay the crime, but to name a reality that all parties must learn to live with, that some cases, though resolved in terms of truth, still leave an unfillable void in the concept of justice, and that void itself becomes an inseparable part of the story, forcing society, the legal system, and those involved to rethink how we define the closure of a case spanning more than half a century. After the fact that the perpetrator could not be prosecuted was firmly established, the case did not close but fell into an even heavier silence, where questions without answers became the final legacy of more than half a century of disappearance. These questions were not purely investigative, as most tools to answer them had been rendered useless by time, but deeper inquiries into motive, responsibility, and the systemic gaps that allowed a child kidnapping to go undetected for so long. The question of the kidnapping motive always stood at the top, because the outcome, the two victims still alive, made this case unfit for the familiar crime patterns of the 1950s. If the purpose was money, no ransom demand was made. If violence, there were no signs of physical harm leading to death. If trafficking, there was no evidence of a network or exchange. The fact that the two children were taken, raised, and kept under hidden identities for years pointed to a more complex motive, possibly tied to personal possession, a desire to build a substitute family, or some psychological obsession that could no longer be traced. However, without a confession, diary, medical or legal record sufficient to confirm a single motive, the question why remained forever suspended like an unfillable void. Parallel to that was the question of who concealed the children's identities, because maintaining a false identity for decades was not just the act of one person in the shadows, but required the existence of multiple links, whether unwitting or conscious. Gaps in birth records, the use of mismatched information, still accepted at the local level, and the lack of data connectivity between states suggested that other adults, at different times, had contributed to sustaining this false identity shell. The question was not only whether they knew the truth, but what they chose to overlook to continue their own lives, and where the line lay between inadvertence and complicity in a still primitive system. The inability to pinpoint specific individual roles made this question particularly uncomfortable, because it did not allow society to point to a clear villain, but forced confrontation with the possibility that many ordinary people, through small and seemingly reasonable decisions, had helped prolong a false reality. The question of why the two children went undetected for more than half a century expanded reflection beyond individuals, and aimed straight at the post-war American social context, where movement between communities was barely monitored. Administrative records were mostly paper-based, and the concept of federal tracking of missing children had hardly formed. In that context, a child without complete paperwork could still attend school, work, marry without triggering any alert mechanisms, especially if the guardian deliberately avoided deep system contacts. However, this question was not just to explain the past, but to warn the present, as it forced the issue that every system, no matter how modern, still has blind spots if coordination, data sharing, and oversight are not consistently maintained. Looking back at the entire 1955 investigation process, the systemic gaps appeared not as a series of grave errors, but as the resonance of many factors: early assumptions, too narrowly framed, lack of resources for long-term investigation, technological limits of the era, and societal pressure to close cases without clear results. No single decision was enough to bear full responsibility for the prolonged failure, but the accumulation of those limits created conditions for the case to slip out of control for decades. Notably, even when viewed through a modern lens, many decisions from that time could still be understood as reasonable within their historical context, making judgment complex and not reducible to right or wrong. These unanswered questions, therefore, were not just the unfinished part of a case, but a reminder that justice and truth do not always walk together completely. For the two victims, these unanswerable questions became an inseparable part of the new identity they had to learn to accept, because knowing who they are did not come with knowing fully why their lives took that turn. For the birth family, they were voids that prevented pain from fully closing, because reunion did not come with a clear story to cling to or a trial to name the crime. And for society, they were uncomfortable but necessary lessons, that not every case can end in absolute clarity, and that asking questions is sometimes as important as finding answers. Within the scope of this part, the unanswered questions are not seen as the final failure of the case, but as the most honest part remaining, where the limits of people, systems, and time are laid bare, forcing those who look back to think more deeply about how we protect children, record identity, and maintain responsibility across generations, because it is in those still unfillable voids that the long-term meaning of the case continues to exist. After the unanswered questions were raised and accepted as an inseparable part of a case spanning more than half a century, the story closes by returning to the core value that the entire journey had aimed for. The identities of the two victims were finally restored. Restoring identity did not happen only at the legal level, where missing persons files were updated and true names recovered, but more importantly at the human level, where two individuals who had lived their whole lives in ambiguity could now place their lives on a correct timeline. Restored identity did not mean the past was repaired or the lost years reclaimed, but it ended the limbo existence where every fragmented memory lacked an anchor and every self-doubt had no resolution. For the two victims, this did not mean complete liberation, but a belated confirmation that their lifelong feeling of not belonging was not a personal failing, but the consequence of a hidden truth. For the birth family, restored identity was proof that their prolonged pain had a real basis, that their waiting was not meaningless, even though the price of knowing the truth was realizing that time had stolen the chance to live together as a complete family. At the center of this entire change was the pivotal role of DNA technology, especially genetic genealogy, which shook the limits once considered insurmountable in traditional investigation. In a context where all physical evidence had vanished, all key witnesses had died, and historical records were full of errors, DNA became the only language still powerful enough to connect present to past. Not only confirming blood relations, DNA technology also created a mechanism forcing the investigative system to revisit old assumptions, restructure timelines, and accept that some cases can only be solved when science has advanced far enough. The role of DNA in this case was not a lone miracle, but the result of long-term accumulation of data, methods, and willingness to share information among individuals and organizations, showing that truth sometimes only emerges when society agrees to open its own archives. From there, the value of the case extends beyond the personal, becoming an important reference for thousands of other cold cases across the United States, especially missing children cases once classified as no hope. This case proves that a cold case does not mean the end, that a closed file does not mean the truth is dead, and that reopening is not always for prosecution, but also for humanitarian goals, restoring identity, history, and dignity to victims. The greatest value this story brings to other cold cases lies in changing the definition of solved, where a case is no longer judged only by whether there is a conviction, but by how much truth has been clarified and how consequences have been acknowledged. At the same time, the case clearly exposes the unavoidable limits of the legal system, where time can allow truth to emerge, but takes away the ability to punish, creating a form of incomplete justice that society must learn to accept. Rather than viewing this as failure, the story offers a different perspective. Justice does not lie only in the courtroom, but also in society daring to confront its own mistakes, and officially recognizing victims' pain. On a deeper level, the significance of the case lies in forcing the system to examine past gaps in identity management, child protection, and federal coordination, reminding that every administrative void, every reasonable assumption in a limited era's context can leave consequences lasting generations. It also emphasizes the importance of archiving, preserving records, and maintaining reopenability, because what seems meaningless today may become tomorrow's key. The final message of the story is not one of complete closure, but of warning and humanity. Continue seeking truth, even knowing it may arrive too late to punish. Invest in science, data, and cross-disciplinary cooperation as a way to protect the future, and recognize victims, not just as investigative subjects, but as people with the right to know who they are, no matter how long they must wait. The case ends not with a sense of fulfillment, but with a deeper awareness of time, identity, and responsibility, where truth, though unable to heal every wound, still holds intrinsic value, because it ends prolonged silence, and returns to people the most basic right to be called by their true name. The story of the two sisters kidnapped in 1955, and only having their identities restored after more than half a century, is not just a solved cold case, but a direct mirror reflecting contemporary American society, where technology advances faster than people's ability to confront its ethical consequences. In the story, the two victims living their entire lives with a feeling of not belonging, contradictory documents, fragmented but unnamed memories, illustrates a very American reality. The system can run smoothly on the surface, but if individuals do not actively question their identity, origins, and rights, serious discrepancies can persist for decades without detection. The first lesson drawn is do not take legal identity for granted. In modern American society, where millions are adopted, immigrate, or born in complex circumstances, verifying, cross-checking, and understanding one's origins is not negative suspicion, but a legitimate right. Second, the story shows that DNA technology only realizes its value when people dare to face the truth. The two victims only regained their identities when they accepted doubting their own lives and proactively submitted DNA to the system, an individual act that created profound societal consequences. In today's life, this reminds us that technology does not automatically deliver justice. It requires individual courage and system readiness to listen. Finally, the story warns that justice does not always come in the form of punishment, but truth still has intrinsic value. In modern America, where many demand someone be held accountable, this case shows that sometimes the most important thing is restoring truth, identity, and dignity to victims, even when the legal system can no longer repair the past. If you believe that truth, even when it arrives late, is still worth listening to, and that every stolen identity deserves to be returned, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following cold cases that have never truly closed. Thank you for staying with us to the very end, and see you in the next video, where another story is waiting to be called by its true name.